Right now, you are surrounded by things that turn. The chair you might be sitting on, the drawer beside you, every vehicle outside your window, every fan, every hinge, every bottle cap. Rotation is so completely woven into your world that it reads as a law of nature rather than as somebody's idea. It is somebody's idea, and it is shockingly recent. Here is the number that should not be possible. Human beings crossed open ocean to reach Australia around 50,000 years ago. That took boats, navigation, and the ability to plan a voyage out of sight of land. We had controlled fire for hundreds of thousands of years. We had woven cloth, ground grain, fired pottery, buried our people with ceremony, and painted caves. The wheel is about 5,500 years old, so our species handled open water 60,000 years before it handled a rolling log. Every civilization that built anything monumental before that date did it without a single wheel on the site. So here is the question. Why did the most obvious machine in the world take longer to arrive than sailing, than farming, than writing itself? What was actually in the way? And why, when it finally appears, does it show up almost everywhere at once, inside about 200 years? Every layer of this gets stranger than the last. Let's go. Let's start with what a wheel actually is, because the circle is the part that never mattered. Put a disc on the ground and roll it. That is trivial. Any child does it, and our ancestors watched round things roll down hillsides for 200,000 years without needing a lesson. The invention is not the disc. The invention is the wheel set. A wheel set is a wheel joined to an axle in a way that lets one turn against the other with almost no resistance while carrying load. That means a round hole in the center of the wheel, a shaft that fits that hole closely enough not to wobble, but loosely enough not to seize, and a hub thick enough that the whole arrangement does not tear itself apart on the first rut. Those tolerances are the entire problem. Make the hole slightly too tight and the axle binds, so you are dragging rather than rolling. Make it slightly too loose and the wheel rocks, chews the hole wider with every turn, and destroys itself. The gap you are aiming for is a few millimeters across a hole bored by hand, in wood, without a lathe. And there is a second, harder condition. The axle and the wheel have to be nearly the same size at the point of contact, and the axle has to be strong enough to carry a load across its whole length without bending. Wood bends. That is what wood does. So the real question is not why nobody thought of a circle. It is why nobody could make two pieces of wood fit each other well enough. Which brings us to the toolkit, and this is where the timeline starts making sense. To bore a clean round hole through a thick wooden hub, you need chisels and gouges that hold an edge. Stone can shape wood, and our ancestors were superb at it, but stone chisels chip and blunt, and cannot cut a deep, straight, cylindrical hole with any precision. Copper tools change that. And notice the dates. Copper metallurgy is established in the Balkans and the Near East through the 5th millennium before the Common Era. The first evidence of wheeled vehicles arrives in the second half of the 4th. The wheel does not appear when somebody has the idea. It appears when somebody has the chisel. And even that is not enough on its own, because a wheeled vehicle needs something to pull it. A loaded cart is useless if a human has to drag it. The point of the wheel is to move loads that a person cannot carry, which means you need cattle strong enough to haul and calm enough to be steered. Cattle were domesticated for meat and milk long before, but the harnessing, the yoke, and the animals bred for pulling are their own long development. So already you need 3 separate things to arrive at once. Metal tools to make the parts, draft animals to move the result, and, less obvious than either, ground worth rolling on. Because here is what is fascinating. On soft ground, a wheel is not an improvement. It is a downgrade. Watch what happens to a narrow wheel on mud, sand, or a plowed field. It sinks, because all the weight of the cart is concentrated on a strip of contact a few centimeters wide. Once it sinks, it stops rolling and starts plowing, and now you are pushing a wall of earth in front of you. A sledge, meanwhile, spreads the same load across a broad, flat runner. On soft or slippery ground, a sledge often beats a cart outright, which is why sledges kept being used in Northern Europe well into the modern era, and why they are still the correct answer on snow. So the wheel is not a universal improvement to transport. It is a specialized tool that only pays off on hard, level, prepared ground, pulled by a strong animal, built with metal-cut parts. Take away any one of those, and it is not worth building. Now let's look at what the oldest evidence actually shows, because the pattern is genuinely odd. In a field at Bronice in southern Poland, archaeologists found a broken clay pot decorated with an incised design. Among the marks is a small, repeated image, a rectangle with 4 circles beneath it and a line running out of the front. A wagon seen from above, with 4 wheels and a pole. It dates to somewhere between about 3,600 and 3,400 years before the Common Era. In the marshes south of Ljubljana in Slovenia, a wooden wheel was pulled out of the peat. Not a picture of one. An actual wheel, about 70 centimeters across, cut from ash with an axle of oak. Around 3,200 years before the Common Era, and preserved because waterlogged ground keeps wood from rotting. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written signs include a pictograph of a sledge on wheels from roughly the same window. Now put those on a map. Southern Poland, Slovenia, southern Iraq, plus early finds from the steppe north of the Black Sea. That is a spread of thousands of kilometers, and they all fall within about 2 or 3 centuries of each other. That is the part that stops archaeologists arguing about which one is first and starts them arguing about what it means. The archaeologist David Anthony has made the case that this pattern points to a single origin followed by very fast transmission. Something this specific, appearing this close together across that distance, looks like an idea traveling, rather than 4 separate strokes of genius. Where it started is still open. Richard Bulliet has argued for the copper mines of the Carpathians, where miners were already pushing loads along narrow galleries with flat, prepared floors, in the dark, over short, repeatable distances. If you wanted to design the perfect place for a wheel to be worth inventing, you would design a mine. Some of you are already thinking about the potter's wheel. Fair question, and it sharpens the point rather than weakening it. Potters in Mesopotamia were spinning clay on a turning platform by around 4,000 years before the Common Era, possibly earlier. Before that, people were using spindles to twist fiber into thread and bow drills to make fire and to bore holes, both of which are rotation harnessed and controlled. So the concept of a thing that turns on a fixed point was thoroughly familiar centuries before anybody rolled a cart. Which takes the romantic version of this story apart completely. Nobody was waiting for the flash of insight. They had the insight. A potter's wheel and a cart wheel are the same geometry. The difference is that a potter's wheel carries a lump of clay and spins in one fixed spot, on a bearing you can make as chunky as you like. A cart wheel carries half a ton, over broken ground, while the bearing is being hammered by every stone it meets. The idea was cheap, the engineering was not. And it is worth being specific about what our ancestors were using instead, because the list is longer and cleverer than people assume. The travois is 2 poles crossed over an animal's shoulders, with the ends dragging behind and a load lashed between them. No wheels, no axle, no road. It crosses grass, scrub, sand, and shallow water. It costs almost nothing to build, and it is repairable anywhere with 2 more poles. Rollers are logs laid in a line under a heavy object, with the crew moving each freed log from the back to the front as the load advances. Slow, labor-heavy, and unbeatable for shifting something enormous over a short distance, which is exactly the job the great stone monuments needed. Sledges are runners under a platform, and they work on snow, on wet clay, on prepared trackways of timber, and on sand under the right conditions. And above all of it, the boat. A dugout carries more than any land vehicle of the same period, needs no route to be built, and moves with the current for free. Look at that list honestly, and the wheel is not filling an obvious gap. It is arriving late into a market that already has 4 working solutions, each of them better than a cart in the conditions it was designed for. For most of human history, a wheel would have made your life harder. Sit with that, because it inverts the way this is always taught. We are told the wheel is the archetype of an obvious idea, the thing so useful that its absence marks a society as backward. The reality is that the wheel is a demanding, fragile, conditional technology that spent its first several thousand years being worse than the alternatives almost everywhere. A group that moves camp 4 times a year across rough country does not want a cart. A cart needs a track. A cart breaks. A cart cannot ford a river, climb a scree slope, or be carried on a shoulder. What that group wants is a travois, a pack animal, a sledge, or a boat. And the boat is the point that gets missed. For carrying serious weight, water beat land for thousands of years after the wheel existed. A river barge moves cargo that 100 carts could not, with no road to build and no axle to break. The wheel did not outcompete those, it waited. And we can prove they were not simply ignorant of it, because there is a civilization that had wheels and chose not to use them for transport at all. Some of you know where this is going. In Mesoamerica, archaeologists have excavated small ceramic figurines, mostly animals, mounted on 4 little wheels turning on wooden axles. Children's toys, or ritual objects, from cultures that never used a wheeled vehicle for anything. They understood the wheel set perfectly. They built working models of it. What they did not have was an animal to pull a cart. No cattle, no horses, no oxen anywhere in the hemisphere. The llama, in the Andes, carries about 1/4 of what a person can and refuses to work beyond its own limits. There is nothing to hitch. Combine that with terrain that is mountain, jungle, or both, and the wheel is not a missed opportunity. It is a correctly rejected option. The Inca built one of the great road networks of the ancient world, tens of thousands of kilometers of it, with staircases cut into it. Staircases. Because the traffic was people and llamas, and for people and llamas, a staircase is better than a ramp. And there is a second invention hiding inside the first one, which is the moment the wheel stops being freight and becomes speed. The wheels we have been talking about are solid, 2 or 3 planks pegged together and cut into a disc, and they are heavy. A solid wooden wheel of any useful size weighs more than a person can comfortably lift, and every gram of that has to be accelerated and stopped on every turn. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, at Sintashta on the steppe east of the Ural Mountains, graves start containing something different. Vehicles with wheels around 1 meter across, with 10 or 12 spokes, and the impressions of them survive in the ground. A spoked wheel does the same job at a fraction of the weight. Less mass to spin up, far less resistance to changing direction, and suddenly a light 2-wheeled vehicle can be pulled at speed by horses rather than dragged at walking pace by oxen. That is the chariot, and it spreads across the ancient world within a few centuries. Egypt never builds wheeled transport for its monuments. It adopts the chariot immediately, because a chariot does not do the job of transport. It is a fast platform that goes where the ground is already flat. The freight wheel and the fast wheel are 2 separate inventions, separated by about 1,500 years, and they solve completely unrelated problems. And there is a third version that arrives even later, which is the strangest gap of all. A wheelbarrow is 1 wheel, 1 load, 1 person, no animal required. It needs no harness, no team, no road wide enough for a cart. It is the version of this technology that an ordinary household could actually use. The earliest clear evidence for it comes from China, roughly in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, which is around 3,500 years after the first cart. Think about that gap. Not the leap from nothing to the wheel. The leap from a full-sized ox-drawn wagon to the idea of putting 1 wheel on a barrow so a single person can shift a load. 3,500 years to make it smaller, which tells you something about how inventions actually work. They do not arrive when they are conceivable. They arrive when somebody has a reason, a material and a surface, all at the same time. So, what ended it? What ended the long era in which the wheel was a bad deal almost everywhere? The road did. Not the wheel, the surface under it. Every step of this story is really about ground. Start with the mines, where the floor was already flat, short, and prepared. Then the first ox tracks between fields and settlements, worn hard by repetition. Then, as towns grow, deliberately leveled streets, because a wheeled cart arriving daily forces you to maintain the route it uses. By the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, there are Mesopotamian cities with prepared roadways and vehicle ruts worn into them. Then the process runs for another 2,000 years until Rome makes it industrial, a layered structure of packed stone, gravel, and fitted paving, cambered so water drains off, running for tens of thousands of kilometers. Once that exists, the arithmetic finally flips permanently. And the road is not the only surface that had to be built. The vehicle had to be met halfway. A rigid four-wheeled wagon has a problem the moment it tries to turn a corner. If both front wheels are fixed to one solid axle, the vehicle can only go forward, and turning means dragging the whole front end sideways across the ground. The answer is a pivoting front axle, so the front pair can swing. It sounds obvious written down. It requires a strong vertical pin, a bearing surface that takes the entire weight of the loaded front, and a frame that does not rack itself apart, and it took a long time to become standard. Then there is the rim. Bare wood wears through, splits along the grain and softens in wet ground, so the wheel gets a tire, first a band of leather or rawhide shrunk on, later strips of copper or iron nailed around the edge, and eventually a single hoop of iron heated, dropped over the rim and quenched so it contracts and clamps the whole wheel together under tension. That last trick means a wheel is no longer held together by the joints between its planks. It is held together by the metal squeezing it, and it stops being a consumable and starts being equipment. And here is the cost of that in numbers. On a hard-prepared surface, a horse pulling a wheeled cart can move roughly 10 times what it can carry on its back. On soft ground, that advantage collapses to nothing, and can go negative once the wheel cuts in. A Roman road took enormous labor per kilometer, dug down through several layers before a single paving stone was placed. That is the actual price of the wheel, and it is paid in road, not in cart. The wheel is the cheap half of the machine. The expensive half is the planet, flattened by hand. Some of you are thinking, this is all very well, but the Egyptians built the pyramids and they had no wheels. What were they doing instead? Fair question, and the answer is one of the neatest pieces of experimental physics in archaeology. They used sledges. A wall painting in the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep shows a colossal statue on a sledge, hauled by rows of men, and standing at the front of the sledge is a figure pouring liquid onto the sand directly in its path. For a long time, that figure was read as ceremonial, somebody making an offering. In 2014, a team led by the physicist Daniel Bond tested it properly. They built a miniature sledge, ran it over sand at different moisture levels, and measured the force required. Dry sand piles up in front of the runner and the resistance climbs. Add the right amount of water and the grains stick together, the surface stiffens, no heap forms, and the pulling force drops by roughly half. Too little water and nothing changes. Too much, and it turns to slurry and gets worse. There is an optimum, and the Egyptians were sitting on it. That figure in the painting was not praying. He was reducing the coefficient of friction, and the crew size in that painting is consistent with the physics. So the pyramids were not built in ignorance of a better way. They were built with a technique that was measurably better for that job, on that surface, at that scale. And the mechanism behind the wheel's arrival has now been modeled directly. In 2024, the engineers Kai James and Lee Allicock published a computational study that let a simulated transport system evolve from simple rollers under a load, optimizing for efficiency at each small step. The model does not jump to a wheel. It cannot. Instead, the rollers gradually develop a groove worn in the middle. The groove deepens, and what emerges at the end is a shape with a narrow central shaft and wide ends. A primitive wheel set, arrived at by increments, with every intermediate stage more efficient than the last. Which matters because the old objection to the roller theory was that there is no useful halfway point between a log and a wheel. The model says there is, and it lies in the wear pattern of the log itself. What if the wheel was never an obvious idea waiting for a clever person? What if it was a conditional tool that only becomes correct when 4 separate things line up? Metal, animals, hard ground, and a reason to repeat the same journey. And what if the reason it looks inevitable to you is simply that you have never in your life stood on ground where it does not work? Because that is the real answer. The wheel did not take a long time because people were slow. It took a long time because for almost all of human history, the world was not paved, and a machine that requires a paved world has to wait for one. Everything the wheel does for you today rests on a surface somebody else built. We traded a world you could cross in any direction on foot for a world that moves 10 times as much, and only along the lines we flattened. and most of us never even notice we are following them. So look again at the nearest thing that turns: the wheel under a chair, the hinge on a door, the cap on a bottle. Every one of them is the same idea our ancestors had while spinning thread and turning pots, thousands of years before it could carry anything. So tell me in the comments, what is the nearest wheel to you right now? And when did you last go somewhere that did not have one? Go somewhere that did not have one. Go somewhere that did not have one.